Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast from London. I'm Ollie Barrett and these are the top stories this hour. Ukraine says it's premature of the United States to evacuate the families of diplomatic staff in Kiev over fears of a looming Russian invasion. Burkina Faso President Roch Kabore is reportedly being detained at a military camp by soldiers following heavy gunfire around his residence. Yemen's Houthi rebels threaten to ramp up attacks on the UAE after 2 ballistic missiles are shot down over Abu Dhabi in the second assault in a week. Taiwan reports one of the largest incursions since October by at least 39 Chinese aircraft into its air defense zone. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison's social media WeChat account, owned by Chinese tech giant Tencent Holdings, has disappeared, prompting accusations of Chinese interference from the Australian government. De facto top seed Daniil Medvedev is pushed to 4 sets as he reaches the men's singles quarterfinals at the Australian Open for the second year running. French veteran Alizé Cornet beats former world number 1 Simona Halep to reach a Grand Slam quarterfinal for the first time.
Her 63rd attempt. She's through to the quarterfinal.
We will begin in the UK, where Prime Minister Boris Johnson has launched an inquiry into claims made by a Muslim lawmaker, Nusrat Ghani, that she was sacked because of her faith. She says when she was fired from a ministerial job in government, she was told her Muslimness was making colleagues uncomfortable. Ghani has welcomed the news that there will be an inquiry, but she says she wants to know its terms of reference. The man at the centre of Ghani's allegations is the government's chief whip, Mark Spencer. He says the claims are completely false and defamatory. Britain's Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, says the claims are incredibly serious, but he's declined to say whether he believes his former government colleague.
Well, first of all, it's a very serious allegation, a very serious claim, and we take it very seriously. There can be no discrimination, Islamophobia or any other kind of discrimination in the Conservative Party. The Chief Whip has overnight made it clear that the allegation is in relation to him, this is Mark Spencer, and he categorically has denied it in what can only be described as the most strenuous terms. What we would say, and what I would say, is that if there's ever any complaint like this, particularly one as serious as this, a formal complaint should be made and it would then be investigated. And this relates back to 2020, and all I would just say as a matter of fact, no formal complaint has been made, but we take this incredibly seriously.
Nusrat Ghani was sacked as a junior transport minister in a reshuffle in 2020. She says she was told by the Tory whips that her Muslim woman minister status was making colleagues feel uncomfortable. In an interview with the Sunday Times, Ghani says she felt humiliated and powerless. And Boris Johnson continues to fight to try and shore up his premiership. He is waiting for the findings of what could be a make-or-break investigation into alleged lockdown parties at Downing Street. The Prime Minister's former senior advisor, Dominic Cummings, is expected to have an interview with the investigation team today. That investigation is being carried out by Cabinet Office official Sue Gray. Police officers who guard Downing Street have reportedly been interviewed, and the Telegraph newspaper claims they've given damning evidence. The Prime Minister's given a variety of explanations about the parties. First, he said he'd been assured no rules had been broken. He has, though, since apologised to the British people over some of the gatherings. He denies knowing about a bring your own booze lockdown gathering on May the 20th, 2020 in advance. Despite having attended it, he says he mistook it for a work event. Well, we're joined now by our London correspondent Benji Hire. Benji, those new claims from Nusrat Ghani, let's start there, about why she was sacked from government. How much extra pressure do they pile on the Prime Minister?
Ollie, these are very serious allegations that could potentially seriously taint the reputation of this government. As you mentioned in the introduction, these are to do with allegations regarding a meeting that happened several years ago now, but those comments in the meeting, if they are true, could, as I say, be fairly significant because of the racial connotations that are involved here. Her allegation that the chief whip at the time said to her that her Muslim identity would be causing a problem for other Conservative colleagues. Now, what's interesting is that Mark Spencer, who's the current chief whip, was not named by Ghani in her complaints, but he almost came out and admitted that he was at the centre of these accusations. But you also heard before the fact that he denies those. He's come out with a quote to say that these allegations are completely false and he considers them defamatory. But he does remain chief whip. So what we have here are comments directed at someone who is still holding a senior position within Boris Johnson's cabinet. Now, an investigation has been launched. That has been welcomed, of course, by Nusrat Ghani. And this might provide a bit of respite for Prime Minister Boris Johnson because it's sort of standard practice within Westminster for ministers, indeed the Prime Minister as well, not to comment on inquiries whilst that investigation is ongoing. But there's still scrutiny from elsewhere. In the past couple of days, further revelations about the activity of whips, potential proper in conduct, about how they are trying to convince MPs to vote with government. Those matters have been handed over to the police. And also that so-called Partygate, the list of accusations and revelations about gatherings in Downing Street during the height of lockdown. And so the Prime Minister is in for another very difficult couple of days.
And Benji, on that note, Sue Gray and that investigation into claims of parties in and around Downing Street, when do we expect her to file that report?
It's not certain when, and we could be waiting a short while longer. The reason being is something you alluded to before, the fact that she's now going to be sitting down with the Prime Minister's former chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, someone who was at the centre of Number 10 operations for so many months, now finds himself on the outside and someone who is critical of the government's decisions, especially in light of those revelations regarding those potential lockdown parties. She's speaking to him. She's already spoken to police. We had imagined that the report would be out in the next couple of days. However, that could be delayed as she would provide a version when published to Boris Johnson, Number 10, and then release it publicly in the hours or days subsequently. And we've also heard that Prime Minister Boris Johnson would want to address the House of Commons, his colleagues, MPs, imminently in order to kind of set his side of the story straight when that report does eventually get released.
And when it does eventually get released, Benji, of course, we don't know what's going to be in it, but do we expect at that point that more Conservative MPs would use that moment to try and remove Boris Johnson as their leader?
I think the answer depends on what is indeed in that report. We've had a number of Conservative MPs coming forward and admitting that however critical they've been of Boris Johnson, they are going to wait to see exactly what that report says and then in the days after that decide what to do. One of those, for instance, David Davies, the former Conservative Party leadership candidate who, you might recall, stood up in the House of Commons, addressed Prime Minister Boris Johnson directly and said, in the name of God, go. Even he is saying that he has not put in a letter calling for Boris Johnson to resign until he sees the findings of that investigation. But one important thing to remember is that Sue Gray, who is a very influential and senior civil servant, is not the judge, jury and executioner here. She is unlikely to advise that Prime Minister Boris Johnson should resign, for instance, because of what she finds in this report. And therefore, if Boris Johnson can kind of weather the storm and see through this report and see through attempts to overthrow him, as he's done in the past couple of days, then he may be able to survive this particular report and continue to be Prime Minister.
OK, thanks, Benji. Thousands of demonstrators have taken to the streets of Brussels to protest against the latest government-imposed COVID-19 restrictions. Over 50,000 people marched in the Belgian capital, at times near the European Commission's headquarters. Last week, Belgian Prime Minister Alexander De Croo announced that all citizens would have to take compulsory booster shots after 5 months to maintain their COVID passes. This 5-month limit is among the tightest in Europe. For neighbouring France, it's 7 months, while the EU-wide guide for travel within the bloc is set at 9 months.
I have had the vaccine myself, but I was very angry that my children had to have the vaccine, and they just took it because of the freedom. They want to travel. They want to do a sport competition, and they can't do it without a vaccine. But they didn't want to, but it's just blackmail.
Belgian authorities deployed riot police to prevent protesters gathering in front of the European Commission headquarters. Police fired tear gas and water cannons. The COVID infection rate in Belgium is at record levels, with an average of 40,000 cases being reported each day. Hong Kong has culled over 2,000 hamsters in an attempt to contain a COVID outbreak. Last week, officials said they'd traced a coronavirus outbreak to a pet shop and ordered the killing of hamsters from dozens of retailers. Despite a public outcry, authorities have urged pet owners to hand over their pets.
Hong Kong authorities on Sunday said one hamster surrendered by pet owners had tested positive for the COVID-19 virus, while over 2,200 hamsters had been culled as the city grappled to contain an outbreak. On Tuesday, officials ordered the killing of hamsters from dozens of pet stores after tracing a coronavirus outbreak to a worker at a shop. People were asked to surrender any hamsters bought on or after December 22nd. While a handful had already tested positive for the virus, this latest case is the first involving a hamster in the care of a pet owner that had tested positive. Despite a public outcry against the crackdown, authorities urged pet owners to continue to hand over their tiny furry pets, given the increasing health risks. The government described the outcry as irrational. In response, thousands of people have offered to adopt unwanted hamsters. Meanwhile, 140 new infections were reported in Hong Kong on Sunday, and there are no signs of the government easing the restrictions.
The Europe director of the World Health Organization, Hans Kluge, says the end of the virus crisis in Europe is plausible after the latest Omicron surge subsides. In an interview with the AFP, Kluge said Omicron has moved from the pandemic to a new phase, and Europe is possibly moving towards an endgame for the virus.
So it's plausible that the region is moving towards a kind of a pandemic endgame, not an endgame of the COVID-19, but a pandemic endgame.
According to Kluge, once the current surge of Omicron in Europe declines, there will be some months of global immunity before the virus makes a comeback in some other form.
So that once that the Omicron wave will subside, there will be for quite some weeks and months a global immunity, either thanks to the vaccine or because people have immunity due to the infection, and also lowering seasonality. So we anticipate that there will be a period of quiet before the COVID-19 may come back towards end of the year, but not necessarily the pandemic coming back.
According to Kluger, the fast-spreading Omicron variant could infect 60% of the European population by March. And he says the top focus for authorities should now be protecting the vulnerable rather than investing time trying to decrease the rate of transmission. In the US, top scientist Anthony Fauci says the Omicron outbreak is going in the right direction as well. And he says that signs have started to emerge of the virus subsiding. The WHO Regional Office for Africa has also announced that cases plummeted in the continent last week. Amid a mutiny against the government in Burkina Faso, President Roch Kabore has been detained at a military camp by soldiers. Earlier, heavy gunfire was reported around his residence in the capital Ouagadougou. Armoured vehicles from the presidential fleet were found pierced with bullets. One of them was also spattered with blood. Residents say they saw a helicopter above the president's private residence. The mutiny comes a day after police used tear gas on demonstrators who were protesting over the government's handling of the jihadist threat in the country.
Gunfire sounded from several military camps in Burkina Faso on Sunday, as mutinying soldiers demanded more support from the government in their fight against Al-Qaeda and Islamic State-linked militants. The government has called for calm and denies that the army has seized power or detained President Roch Kabore. Heavy gunfire was first heard in the early hours at a camp in the capital Ouagadougou, which houses a prison whose inmates include soldiers involved in a failed 2015 coup attempt. That's according to a Reuters reporter who saw soldiers firing into the air inside the camp and at the Ouagadougou International Airport. A witness also reported gunfire at a military camp in Kaya, around 62 miles north of the capital. One of the mutineers, speaking to reporters, issued a series of demands. They include appropriate resources and training for the army, which has suffered severe losses at the hands of militants in recent months. Another demand was the resignations of the Army Chief of Staff and the head of the intelligence services. Hundreds have come out in support of the soldiers, and police fired tear gas in downtown Ouagadougou to disperse around 300 protesters. The government confirmed gunfire at some military camps, but the West African country's defence minister said the reasons were still unclear. Countries in the region are on high alert for coups after successful takeovers in Guinea and Mali over the past 18 months. Earlier this month, Burkinabe authorities arrested a dozen officers on suspicion of conspiring against the government.
In the latest crackdown on pro-democracy protesters in Sudan, armed men have reportedly arrested Sudanese women's rights activist Amira Osman. Osman's arrest comes amid what other activists say is a wave of arrests of prominent civil society figures since a military takeover in October. According to Osman's sister, 15 armed men wearing civilian clothes stormed the activist's house in Al Riyadh on Saturday to arrest her.
They stormed through the door and came into the house. There were so many of them, around 15 men and another 15 outside, carrying guns and rifles.
Osman had been a leading campaigner for women's rights under the rule of former President Omar al-Bashir, who was ousted in a 2019 uprising. Women played a prominent role in the protests that led to al-Bashir's overthrow. The United Nations mission in Sudan has denounced the arrest, calling it a part of repeated violence against women's rights activists in the region. A military coup last year, led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, deposed the civilian government. Dozens of activists and protesters have since been detained. That coup derailed a civilian-military power-sharing deal negotiated after the 2019 removal of the country's long-time ruler Omar al-Bashir. Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok was held under house arrest for weeks following that coup before being reinstated in a November deal. The deal for his return was denounced, though, by many in the civilian coalition, and he announced his resignation on January the 2nd this year as the country's Prime Minister after months of protests. And finally, in Russia, a former circus performer has switched from training big cats for entertainment to rescuing those being neglected. See you tomorrow.
Оказались на гастролях на Кавказе, и к нам...
We were on tour in the Caucasus, and since my wife is a veterinarian, people asked us to help them with animals that were dying, predators, tiger cubs. My wife could not stay indifferent. Oh, what kind of crocodile is eating me? And she said, we must buy out these animals, help them. So we handed over our car to a pawn shop and bought Aston, our very first cat. They are hybrid or a cross, that is, they do not belong to any kind, like the Amur or Bengali tigers, that is. This is a cross, and they do not have a breeding value, so they are not needed for nature. They are not returnable. Such animals most often find themselves in difficult situations because no one protects them.
Royce was bought out of the photo zone by the guys Dima and Yana. He arrived rickety, he was all covered with tetter. After they treated the tetter, he faded all over. He was bald. Now he has hair grown all over again. Essentially, they have bought it out from those who should not keep tigers. Oh, let me catch your tail.
This is right, Arab.